Okay, Nails, thanks for being accommodating to us as we bring in the CFL on TSN's Dave Naylor. And I don't really know where do you want to start on any of those topics, or maybe what's news today in the CFL that you've uncovered.
There's not a lot new this morning that I'm aware of. One of the things we've been trying to do, Rod, over the last day or so is get a sense of, how many players are going to want to play in this thing. And I haven't finished my research on this, but it does appear that I think the majority of guys are going to want to play. And I think there's going to be a lot of this is going to be based on age and experience and what else you have going on in life. That if you've got if you're a player early in your career, maybe you've got 1 or 2 years in the league, you may not have a family. You may be concerned about losing your job permanently if you don't play this year. Those guys, I think, are going to be likely to play. Some of the veteran guys who make the big money, are they going to play? Because even if you crunch the math on what 6 games is worth to them on a per game basis, it's worth it. I think it's going to be interesting to see how many of the in-between guys, the guys that aren't making, $300,000, that aren't quarterbacks, and how many guys who aren't just beginning their career. What do we learn about that sort of middle group? And because that's going to be one of the things that's been really tough to handicap in this whole thing is what's the will to play? And I'm not talking just on the players here for a second. I'm going to talk about the owners as well. Like, I think there are varying degrees of will inside that room among the 9 team representatives, that not everybody is as committed to this as everybody else. And I think that's for the players. So if I was to sort of say, what's an X factor in all this that we're going to see unfold over the next 3 weeks, I think will on both the side of the players and the teams themselves is going to be a big factor.
As you know, Dave, though, at the CFL Board of Governors level, usually only a 2/3 vote passes things. So I guess if a couple teams didn't want to play, they would still play. And maybe the same is true for the players. But what's heartbreaking for me is the Americans. How much have you investigated the border closure and what that's going to mean? I mean, if guys are coming up for a shot, these are guys that don't generally have passports, man. I've been at those free agent camps in the States, right? It's like, if you're coming to camp because you were really good here in Bradenton, Florida, you better go get a passport if you don't have one. Like this, there are a lot of legal hoops for American players that would be coming for the minimum anyways. Have you been looking into that?
Here they are, right? Like most teams have about 60 players, either Americans in the States or Canadians living in the States, basically 60 per team of people who are U.S. residents. If you signed a contract this offseason, and most contracts have been signed months ago, you're told you have to have a passport to cross the border. The trickier thing is now you need a work visa to cross the border because a passport doesn't do it anymore. If you were playing in the CFL last season and your contract did not expire, in other words, you weren't a free agent this offseason, you would still have your work visa to be able to enter the country. But if you signed as a free agent, signed a new contract, your work visa expires with your old contract, those guys wouldn't have their work visas. They would ordinarily pick them up at the start of camp. So there's an issue. But I think the bigger thing is going to be understanding how the CFL bubble is going to work, how foolproof it's going to be, and accounting for the fact that, and again, this is all logistics, but okay, let's say 500 to 600 CFL players are migrating across the border, work visas in hand. How are they getting into the bubble? And how do we make sure they're not coming across with work visas and running around Regina or Winnipeg or Toronto or Hamilton, wherever they cross, for 2 weeks before they enter the bubble and go through their testing? And even I was talking to Barhan and I, do a lot of spitballing on this when we talk about this stuff. We were talking about try to imagine if Winnipeg is the hub and 500 or 600 players are coming to Winnipeg. Can you pick them up 12 in a van, or do you have to pick them up one at a time? Because if you put 12 in a van and drive them in for testing and one guy tests positive, then don't the other 12 have to go into 14-day quarantine? Or I don't know what the implications are of all that. And I don't mean 14-day quarantine within the bubble. I mean isolation. So do you have to individually pick up 500 guys? I don't know how the NHL is doing it, and there must be precedent for this, but there's just so many questions. And I think, it's funny, you've got almost the opposite conversation about the NBA players as you do the CFL players because of what's going on in Florida. Just to put that in context, okay? Florida has had more cases in the last 12 days than Canada has had since January, okay? 12 days ago, Florida passed Canada. Today, Florida is more than double Canada, 12 days later. So the concern in the NBA is, well, how do these players stay safe in that environment? The concern in the CFL is, how does the public stay safe with all these players coming from all these areas? It's like the NBA is worried about players getting infected by the public. CFL is worried about the players infecting the public. And that has to be a concern. And they're going to have to be real assurances that not only the players don't get out, but that nobody gets smuggled in. And that is something that I know people who are worried about that.
And there's so much up in the air with this COVID thing that you can't even set some variables to start making decisions, it seems. But let's put the COVID aside and let's assume that the CFL is going forward with 6 games. With such a limited number of games, do you see a lot of rookies? Do you see a lot of free agents that have never played in the CFL before? Or do you see a lot of recycled, maybe CIS athletes coming up that know the game and let's get these 6 games in and win?
Well, every team's got like 80 plus players under contract right now. So, right, I think you're going to see there's going to be a premium on experience because we don't look. There's probably going to be no preseason, right? The short training camp's going to be short. So to take a U Sport rookie and plug him into your lineup, or even to count on him, I mean, how much experience has he got at that level? And we know that's a slow process anyway for guys stepping out of U Sport. So that's one of the things that I think is, it's going to put a premium on guys that have experience, guys that are veterans. It's funny, you mentioned the 6-game thing, and there's a few advantages. A lot of people are like, why the 6-game thing? And that caught me a little by surprise as well. But I'm going to speculate a little bit on some of the reasons why they may have gone 6 games. For one, I think there is a sense that the longer the season goes, the more risk you have of this thing coming off the rails. And there's a limited time you can put guys in a bubble. So the longer your season is, the greater risk you take, the harder it is to keep everybody from going stir crazy and living in a bubble. 2, the way the CFL salary cap works, I've had owners say to me, why do we broadcast that we have a $5.3 million salary cap when we all spend $7 million? Why don't we publicize that number? Makes our look bigger. Because, of course, you get situations like Bo Levi Mitchell last year's example in Calgary. He goes on 6 game for a third of the season. That saves the Stamps $250,000 off the cap, which they can spend again, right? And that doesn't show up in the 5.3. That's additional money. With having a 6-game schedule, if a player gets injured in week 1 or week 2, he can't go on 6-game injured. So you're going to have a hard cap this year. There's going to be no injury overflow unless they make some amendments to the CBA. But nobody can go on 6-game injured, and then the team gets to spend the money again. The other one is that the pay for the opening week of playoffs last year, I'm led to believe, was about $3,400 per player. That's less than what players make per game per minimum. So if you take a player, let's use Mike Riley, for example, because he's the highest paid player in the league. There's another issue with Mike Riley because he has a $400,000 report and pass bonus in his contract. How are they going to manage that one? Right? There's a problem we can set aside. But let's just take a player who makes $500,000 in the league, and let's say that it's not all in bonus, that was his salary. You would be talking about that player making about $30,000 a game. Well, if that player is playing a playoff game for $3,400 as opposed to being paid his salary $35,000, that saves $30,000 on one player. And I know most of the higher paid players and those guys, they get money through off-season bonuses, so their salaries aren't quite that high. But basically, paying everybody for an extra playoff game, $3,400 each, is going to be a lot less than playing a 7th regular season game would be. So you can see how there's some economic advantages for the league, potentially. And again, this is just speculation on my part and talking to people in the league of why 6 games would be advantageous for the league.
It's funny. You're talking Abu's language as a money guy that he is. So his head was just bobbling as you went. But you're a guy, Dave, that said if they don't play in 2020, you feel the CFL can survive. Can you explain that?
Well, let's go off David Braley's comments, right, which were relayed out of Vancouver by a reporter there, and the whole thing of if we can't play, league dies. I think he's doubled down on that. It just doesn't pass the logic test, and here's why. When Saskatchewan Rough Riders did their AGM 3 weeks ago, right, Craig Reynolds had an availability with reporters, and I was on that, and I asked him. I said, "What's the economic difference for your team if you play this year or if you don't?" And he said, it's marginally better if we play this year. I talked to somebody in a similar position as Craig in the league and pushed them on the same issue. And he said, we think it can be as much as $2 million a team, we think, ahead if we play this year versus not, right? That was the range. That was where he said. And he said, it has to be worth it. It has to be $2 million a team, because anything less than that, it's not worth us taking the risk. If you're coming out ahead $750,000 with your projections, is that really worth the risk of things going off the rails this season? No, he said it has to be worth at least $2 million. Okay, so $2 million a team. Does that make sense to you that the league's existence would hang on $2 million a team? It doesn't. That doesn't pass the sniff test. That's not logical. So then you get into the question of, well, okay, if it's not just money, if the league goes away, well, do we really think the difference between the CFL being in existence and not being in existence is a 6-game season? That doesn't pass the logic test. It's just, like that. It's not hard to look at this stuff and say, does that really make sense? So it doesn't make sense to me. I always go back to the NHL in 04-05, where Gary Bettman shut down the league, and a whole bunch of people, probably me included, screamed that your sport will have irreparable damage if you're not in existence for a year. And what happened when the NHL came back? I was covering the NHL those days. I can tell you what it was like. It was like gangbusters, right? Give us hockey. And in that case, people were pissed off at both the players and the owners because it was a fight about money. Nobody's really pissed off. I mean, people are disappointed in some of the things, but this isn't a traditional labor stoppage over money. This is over a pandemic. So I think people's understanding of why they might not play football this year is much wider than if they'd shut it down over a pure money fight between the players and the owners. So it makes no sense to me that the people who were CFL fans last November in Calgary, when the Grey Cup was being played between the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and the Hamilton Tiger Cats, will be nowhere to be found in the spring of 2021 if the CFL doesn't play this year. It just doesn't pass the logic test.
No, but the one theme through all of these comments from the presidents and owners is that they're going to need some aid somewhere.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Oh,
right.
yeah. And I think that's never gone away. Like, I think when the government kind of slapped them early on, people were like, well, it's not going to happen. Well, no, the conversations have continued. And my understanding is that the likely strategy is to ask the government to pay the players. Okay, because if you're Larry Tannenbaum or David Braley or Bob Young, and the government's writing you checks, the public's going to go, aren't those guys worth hundreds of millions of dollars, right? The optics of it become very difficult. But if all of a sudden, instead of paying it to the owners, they're just covering the players' salaries, the working class heroes of the CFL who are willing to play for a third of their salaries this year, if that's what it comes out to be. And let's be honest, that's not money that guys are going to take away and go on luxurious vacations with. It's stuff they're going to use to pay the bills. It's going to be dumped right back into the economy. And there's a sense that, if they're not working, a lot of them are going to be on the CERB or unemployment or other things. So you can make probably a better economic case, and you can certainly make a better case optically in terms of if the CFL is going to get helped out by the federal government, if it's paying the working class players a third of their salaries. That, I think, the league hopes would be more palatable. And, you do the math of how much that would take. Salary cap's $5.3 million. Guys are going to play for a third of their salaries. That's about 1.7 times 9. So we're talking, what, $15, $17 million, something like that would essentially take care of the salaries for the Canadian Football League for this year. But I don't think they can play without that. There's going to have to be some piece of government assistance. And as much as I understand fans are focused on, is the league going to play this year? And that's what most of our stories are about. I'm not sure there's as much or more attention being paid by the league and its teams to making sure that they can play in 2021 and making sure that the long-term survival of this league is going to be manageable. Because, we don't, one thing we've learned through this thing is we don't know what the next few months, all these commissioners, that are starting up their leagues in the midst of a COVID spike. Do you think in April or May, when they hatched these plans, they thought when they would launch at the end of July that the United States would be setting daily records for new COVID cases? I don't think they thought that at all. I think they thought this was going to be Canada. Even in Ontario, we had 112 new cases yesterday, 118 announced today, and that's the 14 million people that live here. If this was a state, Ontario would be the 5th most populous state. So every time, I get a reaction from an American on Twitter is like, well, of course your cases are low. You don't have any people. Yeah, we would be behind California, Texas, Florida, and New York. and we have 112 cases new, roughly we've been under 150 consistently. I think that's what all these commissioners thought they were getting into when they thought, yeah, we're playing July. And doesn't the virus go away in the heat and the sun and all that? Apparently not, since Texas and Florida are on fire. So, in Canada, it's a much bigger, better environment. And I think that's part of what's at least allowing the conversation to continue. If Ontario and other parts of Canada had COVID spikes that's going on in the U.S., I don't think the CFL conversation would even be going on right now.
No doubt. Nails, this has been awesome. We're enjoying your stuff for sure. Keep it up, my friend, and thanks for the time today. I appreciate you being flexible.
Always enjoy joining the show, Rod. Have a good one, guys.
TSN CFL insider Dave Naylor with us from Toronto.
You're watching Rod Pedersen On Demand. For more of The Rod Pedersen Show, visit rodpedersen.com or follow Rod Pedersen on social media.